monsoon-related tragedies here in South Korea, global meetings to promote diplomacy and security elsewhere, as well as the latest displays of defiance by North Korea. These are some of the events making international headlines in recent days. So what are pundits saying about the extreme weather patterns? And why does North Korea appear to be resuming its provocations? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. There has been a flurry of security summits beyond borders, Pyongyang's provocations on the Korean peninsula, as well as rampant repercussions of rain here in South Korea in recent days. For more on these stories, I have Andres Sanchez Braun here in the studio with me. Andres, it's good to have you back.
Thanks always for having us here.
I also have Steven Borowiec live on the line. Steven, it's good to see you too.
Happy to be here.
Right, Andres, North Korea fired 2 short-range ballistic missiles into the EC in the wee hours of this Wednesday morning. What appears to have been the reason for this latest reckless act of provocation?
Well, you're right. North Korea fired 2 short-range ballistic missiles. They flew around 550 kilometers before splashing in the EC. This seems to be in response for 2 things, apparently, that happened on Tuesday. One was the inaugural meeting of the Nuclear Consultative Group that took place here in Seoul. The other one being the arrival of a submarine, of a U.S. submarine equipped with nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. This is a first in South Korea since 1981. Both of these things respond to what happened in Washington in April when U.S. President Joe Biden and Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol signed the so-called Washington Declaration. Now, in that declaration, the U.S. told Yoon that they were going to enhance the so-called extended deterrence mechanism by establishing this nuclear consultative group, which is sort of a mechanism, a bilateral sort of forum where Korea can be in the know of what potential responses the U.S. could have in case, for example, let's say a North Korean hypothetical attack, and that includes the nuclear options. Therefore, it's called the Nuclear Consultative Group. Among other things that were promised by President Biden was the fact that the U.S. was going to send one of these submarines, the SSBNs, equipped with ballistic nuclear missiles for the first time in more than 40 years to give more visibility to these assets that the U.S. has been, deploying on a rotational temporary basis in the peninsula with the apparent goal of deterring North Korea from, stop the development of weapons of mass destruction. Now, North Korea had actually voiced its condemnation of the submarine arriving in Korea last week. We had that. And then we had Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's sister, suddenly talk about these air incursions or airspace invasions. And then on Wednesday of last week, North Korea launched a solid-fueled long-range ballistic missile. And here we are again, apparently. So who knows what the responses these days for North Korea are going to be. We could expect maybe some sort of action similar to what we've seen today.
Right, and against this backdrop of provocations, Stephen, an American soldier has reportedly been detained in North Korea after willfully crossing into the country. What more can you tell us, Stephen?
There sure are some blank bits to this story. We don't really know anything about this soldier's motivations. We do know that he had encountered some troubles lately. He had, according to press reports, he had served some time in a South Korean correctional facility after being charged with assault. And he'd had a couple of, sort of involved in a couple of violent or disturbing incidents in Seoul. And as I understand it, he was at Incheon Airport and he was about to be transported back to Texas in the U.S. to face additional disciplinary actions. But he somehow was able to get out of custody in the airport and leave the airport and join one of these tours, like a kind of tourist trip to the DMZ, something that I've been on and Andres has probably been on, and whenever our parents come visit us in Korea, they want to take this kind of thing. It's one of the few chances to get really up close to North Korea and to be, right on the border. And so he took this tour and he ran across the border into North Korea. And as far as we know, he was detained by North Korean soldiers. And who knows what will happen now? I mean, I guess it'll be up to him if he decides that he wants to stay in North Korea, or if he changes his mind, if he decides that he wants to somehow agitate to be let out of the country. That's not always easy. There's this long history of U.S. citizens being detained in the North in sometimes inhumane or dangerous conditions for months or years, and then they're having to be kind of high-profile negotiations where perhaps the U.S. will appoint some former political leader or some other prominent person to attempt to negotiate his release. But we're still very far away from those kinds of discussions. I think right as of now, the best thing that we could do is maybe try to better understand this young man's state of mind and what his motivations were. But that having been said, that's going to be very difficult because he's in North Korea, a state that does not respect, freedom of expression. There are real questions as to whether or not he will be able to speak frankly to the outside world, if he'll be able to communicate with his family or with legal representation, or if North Korea might do something like coach him or coerce him into some kind of a statement where, they film him saying something that they've written for him, or altogether a regrettable scenario. I guess just the most pressing matter at this time is just hoping that this young man's human rights are respected in the North and that he doesn't face any kind of imminent danger.
Right, indeed. Well, it is a story that is unfolding as we speak, and we'll keep our audience posted throughout the day, of course. Moving on, Andres, the tragic losses of lives here amid the monsoon have been making international headlines. I believe you've been covering the story as well. That being said, can we start off perhaps with some details about the actual tragedy that has been unfolding here?
Yes, it's actually been a very tough week, as you said. Continuous downpours hitting especially central and southern areas of Korea. President Yoon Suk-yeol just designated 13 special disaster zones. And so far, I think the latest figures point to 44 people dead and 6 still missing. And a total of 1.12 thousand people have been displaced and had to evacuate. Last figures pointed out that around 4,000 of them had not been able to return to their homes, too. We have damage in farmlands, extensive damage. There's like 30,000 hectares of damaged farmland. We have around 700,000 farm animals that actually perished because of the flooding, mostly poultry. We've had problems with transportation up until yesterday. Most of the intercity railway lines were not working entirely, although most of the KTX, the high-speed trains were already, but we still have damage apparently in something like around 180 roads in different points of the country. But most tragically, the problem is, for example, provinces like North Gyeongsang have like 21 people that died, mostly because of landslides. They were either hit directly by the landslides, or they were in buildings that were hit by the landslides and then collapsed. And then, of course, we have the horrifying episode in Cheongju City in Osongup, where a tunnel was flooded on Saturday, and 17 vehicles got trapped inside, and 14 people lost their lives. So horrifying episode.
Right, it was a very, very sad event, of course. Meanwhile, Steven, weather pundits, I believe, are linking the deadly downpours to climate change. What more, Steven, can you tell us, keeping in mind the broader weather picture here in Asia?
Well, climate change is a very big idea. And so I'm always I never know quite how to respond when the discussion is, is climate change causing this? Climate change is a kind of catch-all phrase. It's a sort of abstract idea that we use to wrap in all of the ways that the weather around us is changing. And it could be anything, at least in the Korean context, it could be anything from droughts to floods. I can remember a few times in recent years when there were real serious problems in the agricultural sector because there just was not enough rain falling. This year we have the opposite problem. And, in both of those cases, this question would come up: are these droughts or are these excessive rains attributable to climate change? And that's a question that's probably too big and too complicated for me to answer. But just as an observer of these patterns and of someone who watches the weather, I do think we can say that there does seem to be an increasing preponderance of extreme weather events, and that could be floods, that could be droughts, that could be storms, it could be extreme heat in the summer. All of that does seem to be happening more often. And I mean, just before we came on today, like the weather in South Korea, I'm in Jeju right now, and the weather here is warm, but it's not too uncomfortable. But I think I saw on your screen earlier that it's 39 degrees in Beijing today. It's something like, if not today, then I think yesterday it was something like 38 degrees in Tokyo. So extreme heat and all of the attendant risks that come with that. It could be rain, or it could be just the stresses on the human body that extreme heat can present. These things do seem to be happening more often, and then it's not a huge stretch to suggest that all of this is happening because of the massive amounts of carbon that human beings have put and continue to put into the atmosphere. So I do hope that, there's a debate among scientists as to just how far this has gone and to what extent it is reversible. I can only hope that through a combination of technological innovation and in changing lifestyles, we can stop all this before it gets too extreme, and we'll hopefully in the future we'll have fewer and not more of the kinds of extreme weather events that we've seen in South Korea this week.
Right, I'm sure many share your thoughts and your hopes as well, Steven. Andres, do you suppose that more perhaps could have been done to prevent the losses of lives here in Korea amid the recent downpour?
That's an excellent question, actually. When it comes, for example, to the case in Cheongju, what happened in that tunnel where the vehicles got trapped, it's still way too early. There's an ongoing investigation, and we'll have to wait and see what this investigation concludes. But some of the info that we've got so far is a little concerning. We do know that there were already alerts in place at a certain point, warnings regarding the possibility of the Miho River, which is just 600 meters away from this tunnel, from overflowing. There were warnings activated in that sense. And then apparently there were a couple of calls to the emergency lines in the 2 hours prior to this tragedy happening, where people apparently alerted the emergency services, police and the like, saying, look, it seems that the tunnel is starting to get flooded. So the question is, why did nobody give the order to close transit inside this tunnel? Because 14 precious lives could have been saved. And of course it is concerning, and it does ring a bell of tragic episodes that we've seen here recently, like the Itaewon disaster. But as I say, it's way too early to comment on this. Probably we have to wait until the investigation is over. On the other cases, when it comes to, for example, people being washed away by rivers, streams, being hit by landslides, I agree with Steven. It's probably too early to directly link this with climate change. That's for scientists to do. But in my personal opinion, I also do see that these patterns of extreme weather, we've had a very dry winter and spring, actually, in Korea. I remember on late winter, actually, there was talk of some of the islands in Cholanam-do actually running out of drinking water. And now we have the opposite. There's the downpours are just hitting this area so badly. So these patterns seem to be, repeating themselves, extreme weather more and more often. So one thing maybe that should be done is to tell people, unfortunately, in these rural areas, if you're living by a stream, if you're living by a river, if you're living by a mountainside or a hill, you should take warnings seriously, or not even wait for warnings. If you see the weather is bad, maybe you should evacuate. Then there's another problem here that some Korean media has been talking about. In these rural areas, we know that most of the population tends to be of old age. They're maybe, they're busy with agricultural work. They're not checking on their phones like many of us are doing in urban areas all the time. And then there's another problem too. Many of these areas, let's say counties that are actually maybe the size of quarter of Seoul. These are very large, extensive areas with scarce population, but very large geographically, and where public officials, are maybe, there's very few of them. So we probably need to think about that. Maybe more public officials in charge of emergency in these areas. Even though there's less people, less population to take care about, they seem to be in bigger danger.
Right. Well, prevention is always better than cure. So I'm hoping that the government is listening to our calls as well then. Meanwhile, Stephen, beyond borders, there have been a flurry of diplomatic engagements. Let's begin with the ASEAN-related gatherings, including the regional forum in Indonesia last week. I believe you were there to cover that event, Stephen. Could you tell us a bit about your main takeaways?
Sure. It was interesting being on the ground in an ASEAN country as the senior figures from all these countries had convened to discuss the bloc's shared interests. ASEAN, if you look at all Southeast Asia on a map, it's a quite broad and expansive area, and there are some countries in it that do have a lot in common, but their interests do diverge in a number of areas. In terms of takeaways, two key matters that I think illustrate the complexity of the ASEAN bloc's response to pressing affairs. One would be Myanmar, just because, as we all know, there's a quite extreme situation, humanitarian situation with the conflict in that country, and there's real disparities within the bloc as to what the best way might be to approach that. You have members who have agreed to freeze any kind of contact with the ruling body in that country. And then there's a movement led by some Thai government officials who have been holding kind of, I think we could call them informal meetings with the Myanmar leadership. And that's one area where the bloc disagrees. And another interesting one is the question of Russia, because Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was in attendance in Jakarta, and he was quite enthusiastically pitching ASEAN members on deeper economic ties. One specific thing that he talked about was increasing the use of ASEAN countries' own currencies in financial transactions with Russia, because Russia is cut off from the international system that is denominated in US dollars. So that raises this question as to what extent is ASEAN as a bloc going to be firmly on board with the US-led efforts to isolate Russia as punishment for its invasion of Ukraine, and to what extent should ASEAN countries be able to look out for their own development, their own economic interests, and do what countries such as India have done and drastically increase their ties with Russia. A memorable event for me in Jakarta was I covered a press conference given by the Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi, where she used the expression Southeast Asia was at risk of a Cold War in hot places. And I was able to ask a question at this press conference and kind of push her to be a little more specific as to what she meant by that, as to what she identified as the threats to the region and how the region might respond to them. She was a little bit, like a good diplomat, she was a little bit vague in her response, but her comments and the general tenor of the conversations in Jakarta does highlight the conundrum facing ASEAN, where the idea is, this is still a region of quite impressive development, but there's still a long way to go. There's still a fair amount of poverty in a lot of ASEAN countries. And they collectively and individually need to decide the extent to which they want to pursue those goals, their goals of development on their own or in cooperation as a bloc. And there's inevitably friction there along the way. But I do think that among the ASEAN members, there's a pretty good sense of collectivity, a pretty good sense of that it makes sense to cooperate and it makes sense to work together towards shared goals. So I left with that as one takeaway too.
Right, and speaking about cooperation, and there is also in Jakarta, Indonesia, Foreign Minister Pak Chin sat down with his Chinese counterpart, with China's top diplomat, that is Wang Yi, on the sidelines of the ASEAN Regional Forum. What was your takeaway from that exchange?
Yes, Foreign Minister Pak Chin met Wang Yi, who's the head of the Foreign Affairs Commission of the Chinese Communist Party. They met on the sidelines of this high-level meeting in Jakarta, this ASEAN meeting. Now, this meeting actually, we need to understand that it happens after a series of spats between both countries, being probably the most focused by the media, the one where the Chinese ambassador to Korea, Xing Haiming, actually said that those who bet against China will end up regretting it, which was sort of a threat or an admonishment to Korea on growing too close with the U.S. Now, the foreign minister, the Korean one that is, the foreign ministry, sorry, released a statement on the meeting, and there wasn't too much. It was vague. It was very diplomatic on that sense, once again. But it said that both sides, of course, agreed on the need to keep developing bilateral ties on basically areas of mutual interest. That is, academia. That's politics too. That's economy, for example, including the importance of solidifying supply chains. Now that, of course, on that side is reassuring after what we've seen in the past few months. On the other hand, the statement also pointed out that Minister Pak Chin strongly condemned the launch of the solid-fueled long-range ballistic missile that North Korea executed last week, where apparently Mr. Wang remained silent. So this is probably another example of what we're seeing in China, probably not willing to be very active in playing a role when it comes to, let's say, calming down North Korea in this sense. We've been seeing this not only because of the current relationship between China and Korea, but also, in the larger picture, what we've been seeing, especially since the war in Ukraine, of, two blocs becoming more and more polarized. We have the democracies on one side, we have the more autocratic states on the other. We have Russia and China, for example, exercising their vetoes on in the Security Council meetings. Actually, the one that was convened last week, the meeting, and actually no sanctions were implemented, no new sanctions were implemented against North Korea because of Moscow and Beijing not willing to approve of these. So that kind of tells us probably that China is going to try to keep using their leverage on North Korea, possibly to try to keep South Korea as a little bit closer. We'll see.
Right, but hopefully dialogue channels will remain open so that we can talk and use diplomacy as one way to deal with the tensions here on the Korean Peninsula. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. As always, Andres, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
It was a pleasure being here.
Steven, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. We return same time tomorrow. Join us then. Thank you for watching.